Welcome, everybody. You are live now, so you may begin.
Good afternoon to all of you. Good afternoon to my panelists and individual participants. In this session, we have empaneled some eminent experts from the region and beyond to provide some responses to address the challenges to peace and security the African Union and ECOWAS faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these responses are premised on some of the key recommendations of the WAPSI report and the policy report. We will begin with a presentation by Ambassador Frederick Gatireche Ngoga, and he will share some insights into how the policy management tools that we need to guide the member states to comply with the rule of law and protection of human rights as enshrined in the ECOWAS protocol on democracy and good governance. I think it's quite clear that during the pandemic, a lot of human rights issues arose. And so Ambassador, His Excellency, will share some light on that. Ambassador Frederick is the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Burundi. He's also the focal point for partnerships on the African Union Border Program and regional security mechanisms. So over to you, Ambassador, and then subsequently I'll introduce the other speakers as and when they get ready. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kofi. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. My Commissioner for Political Affairs and Peace and Security, Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, wanted to be here, but then he didn't me. So the theme of this brainstorming session finds complete resonance with what we're trying to do at the African Union, both in terms of substance and approach. Regarding the content, the African Union has been mobilizing AU member states around the AU CDC for an integrated and coordinated approach to the pandemic response. And I'm happy to note that with the commitment and drive of our leaders, the push of the chairperson of the African Union, supported by the AU CDC and the regional economic communities, we have achieved considerable success in order to minimize the negative impacts of the pandemic. In this effort, our partners from different continents, starting with the UN, continental and national partners, have been very supportive. But there is still quite some work to be done, although the pandemic seems to have abated for now. For instance, in the strategic areas of action moving forward, we need to at least pursue 8 key measures. The first one is to develop critical vaccine production capacity on our continent with the much needed solidarity of relevant partners. Second, we need to mobilize critical resources, both domestic and external, especially in the face of crippling debt servicing, in order to alleviate the negative socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. Third, we need to find early solutions to the political and security impacts of the above on the world, and in particular African vulnerable groups. Fourth, we need to build critical resilience capacity and strategic partnerships within and beyond the African continent towards effective response to pandemics and other disasters. Develop and enhance the nexus between governance, peace, security, and development. Fourth, we need to mobilize resources to systematically and effectively address complex political terrorism and violent extremism. Here, I would like to say that our department has an ongoing initiative in collaboration with the UNDP in its preparative phase, and it is us gratifying to note that the Republic of Togo, in collaboration with UNDP, is already showing leadership by organizing an international conference on the subject in Lomé, which they just had. I wish to entreat our other partners to join us in this strategic project. Fifth, we need to prioritize the critical role of women and youth, especially those in rural communities and inner cities. Six, we need to leverage traditional knowledge systems and technology, as well as good practices from elsewhere, appropriate for the African context. But to effectively do so, we need a knowledge approach that drives policymaking and execution, as well as strategic partnerships. That is why, in terms of approach, this event at the beginning of a process, along with other initiatives, also reflects what the AU Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security is trying to do under the leadership of the chairperson of the AU Commission. There is already an AU PAPS, which is our department, and APRM research initiative on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Africa. Furthermore, our department, in collaboration with sister departments of regional economic communities, is also launching what we call the IRECI initiative. This is essentially to be an acknowledged platform around which the African Union anchors vertical and horizontal synergies with key stakeholders in the peace and security sector to provide systematic knowledge approach to the work of the AU Commission, REX, and member states, along with relevant non-state actors. Examples of other similar ongoing initiatives include creating an annual consultation platform with civil society organizations, engage in governance, human rights, peace on the continent, and a plan launched of a process to establish an African network of think tanks, hopefully to be done in the margins of the Accra Reflection Forum on Unconstitutional Changes of Government, which is going to be organized next week from the 15th to the 17th of March. And so on behalf of the chairperson of the EU Commission, Musa Faki Mahamat, my commissioner and my own name, I would like to congratulate ECOWAS Commission and our collaborating partners, particularly the EU and GIZ, for this critical knowledge approach project designed to build institutional resilience in African governance and security. I wish you the best in the deliberation, and I look forward to the sessions today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thanks for that brilliant presentation. I think all of us have learned one or two things from the thoughts you shared. And in fact, a few of the issues you raised have already been highlighted by other speakers in other sessions. Now, at this stage, I'll hand over to Sibyl Osei. I think I should get your name right. Sibyl Nana Ama Osei Ajema Yeboah, my sister, who will be looking at how local capacities can be used to strengthen vaccine research and development to overcome the shortage of global vaccine supplies and misconceptions, and how ECOWAS and AU member states and the private sector can be supported to sustainably develop globally competitive pharmaceutical industries. Sibyl has been at WAHO, the West African Health Organization, for several years now, where she's the professional officer for pharmaceuticals and now the acting principal program officer for public health. She's a pharmacist with vast experience, and she is a fellow of nearly all the colleges of pharmacy in the region. Please welcome Sibyl Anama Osei-Ajimai. Thank you.
Thank you, a moderator. Please, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So we'll be looking at the responses to peace security challenges amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. So the next slide, please. We all know that the SARS outbreaks has been in series, not only for COVID. We could remember in 2023, and then the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, Ebola 2014, as well as the led declarations and resolutions by the UN Security Council, which marked a threat to international peace and security, the concept of global health security. We could also look at the 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals that also impacts on actually the fundamental principles of human security. As such, the COVID-19 pandemic actually, in the scope of the magnitude of this disease, it completely changed the lives of human beings, individuals and communities, the economic, social, and political, security, and psychological dimensions of the population globally, as compared to the other pandemics that we have experienced. It's also affected relationship due to mitigation measures such as the lockdowns and travel limitations, creating social tensions, fear. The social media even made it worse with false rumors on the vaccine development and vaccination, which affected vaccination process so far. The inequality and inequitable access to remedies such as vaccines, as well as the disparity and distinction between the different government commitments and investment in health issues. Next slide. Next slide, please. So you can see that the impact do not only affect the health system, but it had total human issues in terms of governance, because it is actually a people-centered approach that addresses the root cause of insecurity among the population. We could look at these 6 key areas in terms of health, medicines, access, food security, community security, environment, and the economic. I believe there are a lot of discussions so far for the past 2 days have dwell on some of these areas. So I will look at the health security, which, and then of course the medicine access, which talks about health services as well as the access to medicines and vaccines. Next slide. So if you look at the vulnerability across the globe, which migrate from the world to Africa and of course to ECOWAS, it's an indication that no country was left out of this pandemic. We have almost about 446 plus million cases and a death of about 5 million cases. And we're looking at about 5.6% of the total population that were of the world, 7.6 billion population that had been affected, and about 1.3% of death occurrence. And in the same vein, on the continent of Africa, it is also reflective, and as well as the ECOWAS region, given the statistics that we have today. Next slide. Now, the current waves that we have experienced globally has been by major 4, but there are some countries that are actually entering the 5th waves. And it goes with death as well. As the incidence occurs in the various countries, it follows with the death rates following the same wave pattern. It shows that the pandemic actually had an impact, and it also brought fear. And the fact that we had to also find means to mitigate it became an issue, because we have to accelerate the processes in all angles, in terms of health, in terms of development, in terms of infrastructure, and also in terms of collaboration across board. It brought out the vulnerability of every country, regardless whether you're developed or underdeveloped. It's an indication that we need to work together as people and as countries. Next slide. Now, coming down to West Africa, as per the slide before this, please. As per the population, we realized that there was an inequality in the receipts of vaccines. It's also told a story in the sense that we didn't have means to produce our own vaccines. We have to wait for supplies from other partners and donations from other institutions like the Gavi and the COVAX and AVAX and many others. Were our governments ready? How well were we committed in terms of financing ourselves or investing in this process? So even though we have some substantial amount of vaccines, the issue of the rumor and the effect or the impact on vaccination also could not even let us accelerate the process, even with the amount of the little vaccines that we had. As at 7th of March, just about 3 days ago, we have only been able to utilize 45% of the vaccines that we have received, even though we are saying that we have very little, because people are reluctant to be vaccinated. Here we're looking at the first dose as received, administered, the first and second dose, and the stock of vaccines that are there. And some are almost near to expiration, because when we receive them, they're quite close to expiration, and depending on which country can move fast in terms of vaccination, it also tells a story as to the stock that we may have at the end of the day. Next slide. So if you look at the population, as I say, we look at it today in terms of the 406 million population of the ECOWAS, we've been able to vaccinate 17.2% across the region. But if you also want to look at the 70% coverage that we are proposing as a continent, in terms of our population, we look at 284.2 million population. As at March, we've only been able to vaccinate 24.56%. We are nowhere near the 50%, not even to 70. So there's more work to be done here. And it also means that it has to translate into self-sufficiency. It translates into the fact that we have to prepare for the next In treating this one, mitigating this COVID, and the next pandemic, how we prepare? These are the questions that we should ask ourselves. Do we have means to produce our own vaccines, or we have to continue waiting for a country or a benevolent person to bring us something, or a philanthropist to donate vaccines to us? Next slide. Next slide, please. So if you look at the landscape of the production vaccines, especially with COVID vaccine production across the region, we have and of course globally, we have about 221 production facilities globally. But for Africa, we can look at only 10. And even this 10, most of them are not end-to-end production capacities. They either fill and finish, or we'll call it in the terms of MSF, just packaging. So let's look at the next slide to see how this transition is moving in terms of production and manufacturing, developing the technology, and then translating them into end product for the users to benefit. Next slide. So if you look at the content with the 10 vaccine manufacturing institutions that we have, to be able to produce COVID, some were producing other vaccines already. Let's take example, Senegal in the Institut Pasteur, they're producing yellow fever. So if they have to be supported to produce vaccine, that means they need collaboration. And so far, the collaboration that we had is geared towards fill and finish. And it means that you cannot translate this into the development of other products or other types of vaccines. So it's still not enough. We may produce what we need, but the next episode of infection or pandemic, we will also find ourselves in the same situation where we have to depend on others. So we need to have more scientific technological development where we can sustain ourselves from end-to-end production. And that's what the region or the continent should be looking at. We appreciate the fill and finish levels. We appreciate the way forward, but to me and to the region and onto the continent, it is not enough. The next slide. So we look down to the ECOWAS potential vaccine industries. We have industries or vaccine development components within our units that are aspiring to produce vaccines. And we have also got supporting organizations and partners who are ready to help. We look at bio-vaccines in Nigeria, Innovative Biotech, and this industry is actually is a leader in the industrial development in the region. The Innovative Biotech, they have been able to develop their own drug substance. That is the particle technology with the help of MEC and Technovax and other lead supporters, industries and developers. We've also have a collaborative consortium between 3 industries in Ghana, Dan Adams, NS Chemist, and Kida Pharma, who are also looking into production of vaccines. And they're not only looking at COVID vaccine, they're looking into other vaccines that will be necessary for the region and the continent, especially, the childhood vaccines as well. We have the Pharmanova, also known as Atlantic Life Sciences. We have the Pfizer Riker and the Institut Pasteur. So if you look at these 6 industries in the region, we can actually lead them as a continent and as a region to be able to achieve the goal that is expected. Next slide, please. So then the question is, how does the continent or the region address the vaccine security issue? We lack it, yet we need it. And look at the consumption of vaccines that are produced globally. Africa consumes more than 50% of global vaccines. So it means that this is a marketplace for vaccine, and we need to develop ourselves. So a continental or regional vaccine technology, intellectual property support services are paramount. And we have to also review the existing ECOWAS trade flexibility policy and guidance that already have been done to strengthen the vaccine potency area and the element therein, to initiate pool vaccine patent licensing for sub-licensing in collaboration with international partners, organize a meeting with the local vaccine manufacturers to consolidate efforts and easy access to tech and intellectual property. We also have to develop clear mechanism to engage research institutions. I'm happy about the PAPM initiative done by the AWIDA NEPAD on the continent as well, to look at the fact that we can have our own research institutions established. We're looking at what African Research Universities Alliance also exists. That would help us to have the vaccine research and development components that will be needed, and also collaborate effectively with public research organizations with relevant vaccine patent portfolio and R&D pipelines. There are some that are there, but they need support to push them to be able to come out with their findings to be able to use for the region or on the continent. Next slide, please. Again, to ensure vaccine supply and production on the continent and in ECOWAS, capacity building is relevant. Training, developing ourselves, to move from the upstream, which is the API, to the downstream, the finished product. And that is what Innovative Biotech has actually come out with. And he is ready in various conversations to share his technology with other manufacturing institutions or units on the continent. Then also the fact that we are having the mRNA technology being shared by other partners, but we think that that alone is not enough, especially when all of them or most of them are looking up to fill and finish capacity development. We need to have our own regional capacity. We need to have our own trained scientists and regulators on vaccine development and regulations. And interestingly, most of them, you could find them in diaspora. So how does the region or the continent bring them in to play their role, to train other capacities in the region and on the continent? Next slide. Next slide, please. So here again, we look at promoting the public-private sector to support a sustainable, competitive pharmaceutical industry for a secured and reliable manufacturing. Can I, the slide before this, please? For a reliable supply of quality and affordable. But if we are going to focus only on fill and finish and without drug substance and API manufacturing capacity, then the continent would forever remain where we are. So we need to move on. And that could even start from a single technology or at least two technologies. Then we expand through that and scale up. We need to also have a revolving fund and pool procurement mechanism so that when manufacturers, it becomes an incentive for manufacturers to move through to invest and to look for investment so that they're sure that whenever they produce whatever they've done, they're short of the market, which is very important as an incentive for manufacturers to move forward. The next slide, I'll be finishing soon. Next slide, please. And as such, for us to be able to put this idea, the region, ECOWAS, has decided to engage the local manufacturers and those aspiring in a meeting on 21st to 22nd of April in Accra to define a framework for collaboration and technological exchange and develop a framework for vaccine producers in the ECOWAS region, and also identify the bottleneck that prevents local production from taking off. Identify and define the types of vaccines to be produced for the region by each manufacturer. Why are we saying that? Are we all going to produce COVID vaccines? No, then the market will be choked. But there are other 22 other vaccines that have not been touched. Childhood vaccines, the anti-snake, and other venoms that could also be done easily within the region. And that shared market will help them to move forward. And to also define the short, medium, and long-term strategy to boost vaccine production. And engage more partners and biotechnological developers to liaise with these local manufacturers. Next slide. Thank you. Merci, obrigado for listening. I hope I'll be able to answer the various questions that will come back. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Sibyl, for that brilliant presentation again. Without wasting time, I'll hand over to Justice. And as you rightly said, in the question and answers period, you had the opportunity to expand on some of the issues you raised further. Justice is a staff of the USAID West Africa in charge of program management. And he will be looking at the issue of how we can harness the comparative strength of civil society organizations, the private sector, media, and communities. Justice is an expert in mediation, conflict mediation, peace building, and elections. He has considerable experience working in the area of peace and security in Ghana, the West African region, and beyond. And he has worked with the National Peace Council of Ghana and also collaborates with the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping and Training Center to strengthen the capacity of security agencies across the West African sub-region. Please welcome Justice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buzia, for the very generous introduction. And let me also say a very big thank you to the organizers for inviting USA to participate in this very important event. It's also a very great pleasure today to be here and to share the platform with some very distinguished members. So thank you very much. I think my task is a pretty straightforward one, as you have indicated. Basically to analyze how we can harness the comparative strengths of civil society organizations. If you hear me say CSOs, basically it's the same as the civil society organizations, private sector, the media, communities in responding to future pandemics. So basically what I am seeking to do is that how I'll begin by trying to place into perspective all these stakeholders, what are some of the roles that they have played even prior to COVID and then with COVID, and then what challenges exist that we need to work on before another pandemic so that we can harness whatever strength that there is. So basically that's how I'm going to structure my intervention in this particular regard. So for instance, if you take civil society organizations, we know they have been around for a very long time within the West Africa region and even beyond. And they have been key development agents, in that particular regard. So for instance, if you take in the area of peace building, if you take the area of development, every aspect of our lives, and even if you look at some aspects that the government even has light footprints, you have civil society organizations venturing into those areas. You're talking about disaster risk reduction, climate change, among others. And of course, when we talk about civil society organizations, someone having my bias in terms of areas of peace and security, you look at the West Africa Network for Peace Building, WANEP, for instance, they have done a lot of work, particularly in dealing with issues about conflict, in mediation, in election, preventing election-related violence. And I remember not just a few years back, the USAID, for instance, we collaborated with them in order to intervene in at least 5 elections to ensure that all early warning signals were picked and dealt with even before they led to a full-blown conflict. So again, that brings to bear how civil society organizations have been very important in that regard. Of course, the media, which we often refer to as the fourth estate of the realm, have also been very, very useful, particularly when it comes to the area of democratic consolidation. We all know the role that they have played to make sure that at the end of the day, citizens' rights are respected. They're able to give voice to the people, and then this also helps in participation. Just to give some example of how working with the media can help give voice and enhance participation. USAID had this project which we call the Voices for Peace, which is in the Lake Chad Basin. Basically, there were radio stations that were set up in order for the people to discuss how they themselves can deal with the issue of violent extremism. And there were some great positives that came out of it because you had citizen participation as a result of the open space that the media platform provided for them. So again, that emphasizes how important that they are. Then, of course, the private sector, as we have always said, is the engine of growth. You know, they have always provided that kind of support to government in terms of areas of employment and even provision of services through sometimes corporate social responsibilities, among others. So as on the whole, these stakeholders that we have mentioned have been around for some time. But I dare say that their relevance, or we saw most of them step up to the plate during the COVID pandemic, you know, affected them, there's no doubt about that. But they were able to adopt new measures, new mechanisms in order to be able to deal with the new situation that we all faced. So for instance, there's this research or this survey that was conducted by the African NGOs and then EPIC Africa, you know, between April and May 2020, which involved 44 African countries. And the study revealed that you had 85% of civil society organizations introducing new programs and interventions, either to augment or support the work that government was doing to deal with the issue of the COVID pandemic, or trying to even serve as a watchdog to government as it undertook measures to deal with you know, the COVID pandemic. And what are some of these things? One of the areas that civil society organizations in particular did well was by increasing their watchdog role. Because if you look at the Transparency International report that was issued in 2020, it kind of cautioned that it is during emergency that you have corruption is always on the rise during emergencies. You have people have to either bribe their way in order to be able to get things done. Government or non-government agencies are receiving a lot of aid, and you know, things begin to trickle in and people don't tend to be accountable. But if you look at what civil society organizations did, they kind of increased their watchdog role in order to ensure that a lot of the things that government and its agencies did were above board, you know, or beyond reproach. So that's one of the things that I think CSOs did, which was very good in the pandemic era. And I think when the ambassador was speaking, he did mention that if you look at the COVID, one of it was, it led to, apart from the security situations, you had some governments trying to take advantage of it by postponing elections. You know, some used it as a kind of a smoke screen in order to introduce other legislations that were targeted at opposition and all those other things. But you have, again, civil society organizations mobilizing in order to ensure that some of those things did not happen. And I think that's something that is very important in that regard. Now, if you talk about the media and the COVID-19, I think we all agree that they played a key role, particularly the traditional media, and most of them we know have found their way onto social media and other platforms. And one of the biggest challenge actually of COVID was the issue of fake news, you know, from how COVID came about to what COVID can do to you. And I think my sister Cyril just mentioned how we still have a lot of vaccine, but we haven't taken them, you know, all sort of stories around vaccine. And I think the media has rallied around in order to support the effort of government in order to disabuse the minds of people. So, for instance, the Media Foundation for West Africa came up with a very interesting project, which is known as the Fact Check Project, that, you know, was able to put out accurate information anytime something came. You know, they were able to counter that particular narrative. And that is something that I think was or is worth celebrating. The private sector, again, I think we always, you know, give them the backlash that we are not seeing enough being done by private sector. But I think during the COVID, and I can speak in the case of Ghana, one of the things that was done almost immediately was that the private sector came up with what was known as the private sector fund, you know, and within a matter of few months, we're able to put up about 100-bed infectious disease center here in Accra. And it was done in record time. The level of efficiency and everything that was done was superb, you know. And I think the government of Ghana has on countless occasions agreed that that intervention was also contributed significantly in Ghana's successful fight against COVID. And I think in Nigeria, you had a similar thing, the Coalition Against COVID-19, that's the COVID, which involved about 50 private sector companies, coming together. Also, greatly augmented what government did by providing personal protective equipment, or the PPEs as we have come to call them. But you see, despite all these things that I have said, all this particularly or seemingly rosy picture that has been painted about the role of these stakeholders, particularly when it comes to the fight of COVID, it's not all been rosy. There've been a lot of stumbling blocks in that particular regard. And I think one of the things that the African Union particularly did was that it kind of tried to ensure that there is a united front, or Africa presents a united front in trying to deal with the issue of COVID, so that we don't have different countries stamping on each other in order to get vaccines or everything. So one of the things that they did was to put together that committee of eminent persons. You had Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala of what's the name? Just forgot. Then Donald Kaburika. You have Tijani Tiam, among other persons, Trevor Manuel, all forming this kind of special envoys in order to be able to coordinate, the work that the African countries did. We also saw that they kind of instituted the COVID-19 African Vaccine Acquisition Tax Team. So this is just to say that coordination is very important in this regard. But then if you look at the member states, this seems not to have trickled down very well. In some instances, you still had governments trying to either push away the media, pushing away civil society, or even pushing away the private sector who were trying to help, And again, statistics from the African NGOs and the EPIC Africa, which I referred to earlier, estimates that nearly 72% of CSOs reported that governments fail to recognize and use their local skills, experience, and network. This is something that is very troubling, particularly so, as I have indicated, that the African Union, or at a very high level, we are trying to build synergy. But then if you come to our the lower level, governments were really not willing in order to be able to cooperate with civil society organizations. So this definitely is something that is worrying, that we need to address ahead of any future pandemic. Now, if you even take the case of media, we all know that in certain instances, the relationship between the government and the media has been very frosty, arrest and all other things. And one would have thought that because of the role that the media was playing in supporting government, particularly in countering fake news, they would have been partners. But you still had a lot of abuse that was happening. Again, if you look at the Media Foundation for West Africa, their report, they indicated that the pandemic led to attacks, detention, even in certain instances, judicial penalty against journalists. They mentioned the case of Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, where a civil court imposed a fine of about CFA 5 million at that time, which translated to nearly $8,400 on some senior journalists because they had published the news that some people had COVID and they were taken to prison, and it had a way of, spreading. Yes, much as they might have used the legal process, but we all know that some of these legal processes sometimes serve as a kind of a hindrance on the media, because there's nothing that is worse than the media trying to self-censor itself in order to be able to come up with information. We're never going to get there. So that's something that really was a major issue during the COVID pandemic. And of course, we have the private sector. A lot of them, had to fold up the support that they were receiving. A lot of them could not receive it, and then it led to unemployment and other things. So generally, the COVID, or the kind of relationship also between them and the state, kind of brought some other problem. So now I think I now come to the most important part of my presentation, which is how do we then harness the strengths of these CSOs ahead of any future pandemic, looking at the relationship that has existed in the just ended, I use just ended COVID-19, but it hasn't ended yet. And so I think one of the first things that we need to do is to start building that synergy now. Because if you look at all the instances that I have recounted, be it civil society organizations, be it the media, they have been relationship, or the frosty relationships have existed before the coming in of COVID. So because the relationship did not exist, it was very difficult to get them to marry at that last minute. So I think what COVID has taught us is we need to start building this synergy from the word go. And we have to also ensure that our civil society organizations also have the capacity, they are fit for purpose in order to be able to augment the governmental support, you know.
I'm so
And
sorry, Justice, to interrupt, but we are running out of time. I'm wondering if Dr. Coffey can rather than just take the closing remarks, because we need to go into the next feedback session.
no problem, that's fine. I think I was just running up, so that's fine. So thank you, and over to you, Dr. Coffey.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks to my presenters for a brilliant job. You know, you've done very well. The presentations have been quite illuminating. I think you have the opportunity to respond to some of the issues and the question and answer time. So on behalf of obviously myself and the organizers of this meeting, I would like to thank you and hope to see you in the question and answer room. Thank you.